Evening. The third day after Shell. Mavere bustled for the door, letting Desi close it behind her. She let her satchel down and slipped off her raincoat before reaching for Desi's. It was midweek, and Tom had suggested a family dinner for her and Desi tonight, a gesture that felt comforting against the unknowns of the coming Shell. It felt like Leia should be there, but it was also a sign of hope. "We're home," she called out, smiling at Desi as she looked around the unfamiliar apartment with a hint of uncertainty. They spent time at Tom's studio, but this was the first time Deshin had visited her home. She nodded reassuringly to Desi as she called out, "Tom?" "I'm in here." His voice echoed from the living room. That wasn't unusual, but there was something immediately off about his tone. She left her satchel behind in the hallway and hurried inside. Tom sat on the couch, his cheeks gleaming weirdly. In all the time she'd known him, she'd never seen him cry, but now silent tears rolled down his face, his eyes puffy and red, and the oddest thing struck her in that moment. Men cried. Chanda could sob when the mood had taken him. Tom wasn't making a sound. It was perhaps the most alien thing she'd ever seen him do. She cast aside her disorientation. The tears were there. They were real, and she rushed to his side. "Tom, what is it? What's the matter?" "Father, what's wrong?" Deshin's alarm joined in as she hurried to Tom's other side, sharing a desperate look with Mavere. Even on the anniversary of Earth's invasion, they had never seen him like this. Deshin was clearly just as lost, and in that moment, Mavere couldn't decide if that was a good thing or bad. "Tom," she tried again, imploring him to reach back as she took his hand. He stared at her distantly, a dull gaze as if light years away. "What's the matter? Please, talk to us." She watched as he licked his lips before gesturing faintly to his omnipad. I got a letter from Earth." His voice choked with the effort to speak, but he pushed through. "Someone very dear to me died." Apprehension filled her, but at least there was an understanding. She didn't know how to comfort him, but she had to try. "Your sister?" she ventured, hazarding a guess. He shook his head awkwardly. "No. Cat. Her name was Cindy. We called her Cat." Tom shook his head as fresh tears cascaded down his cheeks, and he closed his eyes, hunching over against his invisible pain. I wish you'd met her." "What happened?" Desi looked at the omnipad before looking at her, and Miv shook her head slightly. Desi hadn't experienced a father in her life, and this conversation would unfold in its own time. That was just the way things worked. Tom shrugged a few times, then shook his head, unable to look at either of them, his eyes screwed shut. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with effort. "Paul says she had a stroke. She lived alone and was already gone when they found her. I don't know, Miv. I just don't know." "Don't know what, Tom?" She squeezed his hand as Desi took hold of his other fretfully. "How much is too much to bear, Miv?" He opened his eyes, an angry red and filled with anguish. If it hadn't been her husband, she would have been shocked. His expression pleaded with her, even as his voice stayed steady. "I've been scared of this Shell. Ever since the library, I've known there were risks. But now I have you and Desi and Leia in my life. I'm terrified of losing everything all over again. Now this, right out of the blue. How much is too much?" "Killer teaches that we only get what we can handle, Tom, and I've seen you handle so much," she offered, searching her heart for something to ease the raw pain radiating from him. "But I don't know. Plutara doesn't agree." "I don't agree either. It's starting to feel like I'm drowning." He shook his head before wiping away the tears. He took her hand again as fresh ones replaced the old. "I don't want her to be gone." "Can you talk about it? Tell me about her?" Miv asked cautiously, knowing Tom needed to be understood. Tom only spoke when he was ready, and she prayed this news wouldn't set him back, and that it wasn't coming as a dark omen. About Kat? Tom attempted to smile, though his eyes remained shut, and it ended as a miserable parody. We met on an early summer night, and there was a girl with a mandolin. He squeezed her hand once, and she felt a wave of relief. If he was talking, that was a good sign. He opened his eyes again, gazing at Deshin. He was still crying, and the words started out slowly, but they started to flow. You'll learn, Desi. If our lives are stories, then meeting a friend for life deserves its own chapter. That was how I met Cindy. I was around 18, and I went to see some friends at a club we all went to. There was a girl about my age there with dark hair, a punk hairdo, short on the sides. She was sitting there strumming a mandolin. He managed something like a rueful chuckle. That's sort of a guitar. Turned out it wasn't hers and she didn't know how to play it, but it didn't matter. I screwed up my courage to say hello. That started a friendship that lasted my whole life. Cindy had an infectious laugh, always seemed to be able to find a bright side, and somehow we were always there for each other at the right times. He sniffled, trying his best to stop the tears. She was my beloved friend. Tom hunched over again, and she slipped an arm about him, as his breath came in ragged whispers. She reached over, pulling Desi into their embrace, and together they held him tight. Captain? Vaco spoke up, her voice barely registering with Solani. I think you need to pull up Professor Pelavon's camera. She stared in the monitor, her mind dulled by the depths of her private despair. How could Vay ask that? She was a member of her pod, and right now her last lifeline of happiness was unraveling. Her life felt like a jumbled mixture of dashed hopes and shattered dreams, all because of her mistake. She'd never seen a man so utterly miserable, and it was all her fault. Surely Mavere would step in, calmly coaxing him back to himself, but inside she'd be furious, and who could blame her? Captain, you really need to see this now, please? Vay's voice held a sense of urgency. How could she rub salt into her pain like that? Carla, pull camera 43 up on the main screen. They wanted to see my humiliation? Fine. The whole bunker will know soon enough. Reluctantly, Solani gestured for the camera to go live, her heart sinking under the weight of what awaited her, the depths of her mistake crushing her spirit. Before you showed up in my life, I think the only thing that kept me going was this group session Paul held. Strangers would come and go, but every week I'd see Paul and Matt and Cindy there. Even just staring at those damn linoleum floors gave me somewhere to be. Tom stared into space, but his gaze was keener, as if swimming through the currents of memory. I needed that. I know we both lost people, and I don't want to wallow in this, but there's just this awful hole in my chest all over again. I can't believe she's gone. The waves come and go, but they listen to no one, Miv said, her voice steady and comforting, as she held on to them both. We'll ride them out together, and in time you'll remember her without tears. You'll feel fortunate to remember her. I know. You're right. He paused, gathering himself as his tears abated. It would just take a bit to get there. She sounds like she'd have been a good co-mother, Deshin said tentatively. The best. Tom slipped his arm around them both and hugged them to him before taking a deep breath, like a diver emerging from a sea of dark dreams. We got an email from Solani too. I know, Miv said neutrally, biding her time. Have you opened it yet? I opened the other first, so not yet. I'm going to cry for a while over this, but not this shell, and not tomorrow. I'll call Solani tomorrow. Tom sniffed once more, but he nodded, his tears ending. I like her, don't you? I do, Miv replied softly, intertwining her fingers with Tom and Deshin's. The tide of Tom's grief was receding, revealing a distant shore where joy and healing awaited for all of them. All right. I promised us a family dinner. Tom squeezed her once more before pushing up from the sofa, the glimmer of himself returning. Time to get cooking.
You'll reach out to her tomorrow?
Miv asked, giving Desi a cautious wink. Nudging him now wouldn't hurt if it kept him distracted. I'll message her tomorrow. I promise. Letzi watched the storm roll out. Winter was near and the nights were dark early, but the rain had faded from the torrent of the storm front into something heavy and long. Over the afternoon it had come down in torrents, then steadily drew off. Not heavy, but spitting and dreary. The memory of Desala's visit today lingered, etched into Letzi's thoughts. In their first year together, Desala had occasionally been a challenge to bear, but she had always found time to offer assistance. Despite Desala's occasionally irritable nature, Letzi had grown accustomed to her fluctuating moods and competitive spirit. It was that same determination and unwavering focus that made her bright, but complicated. Her temper could be a difficult river to cross, but Desala had strong principles and did not suffer falls. Thankfully, she'd never seen Letzi in that light. Desala wasn't always easy. She had a sharp tongue that could get the better of her, yet there was a comfort knowing exactly where you stood. That mattered more than anything else. Over time, Letzi came to accept their role as friends. It wasn't an equal partnership, but she'd come to suspect some hurt hated Desala that made equality too much to give. Nevertheless, Desala never directed her ire or frustration at Letzi, and despite the inequality, she found that was enough to work with. Popular with the 3rd and 4th year girls, Desala had been taught how to be charming, and could be quite good at it. But, charming or bitter, she never lied. In a way, it was Desala's temper that made her understandable. She spent the last 4 years living a lie with her own family, and if anger had never been a useful solution, she'd known its appeal. It just hadn't been an option she could afford.
So why couldn't I be just as honest and tell her the whole truth? Goddess, how do I take off a mask before it stops being a mask?
Reflecting on the past, she remembered the incident like it was yesterday. She'd come home from an outing to an art supply store and walked in clutching the new hollow filters her co brought her. Her childhood hadn't been pleasant, but she also hadn't gone without. Her parents actively supported her artistic pursuits, and her light sculpts even won awards. It had all made sense in hindsight. Art kept her busy and out of the way. It was something she did well, and they could point to her achievements with pride. The violence had stopped years before, but the hard words still came when provoked. Words that never got used with her sisters.
And I was so desperate for anything like love that I overlooked all of it.
She'd walked into the kitchen wearing a smile for their guest. Her mother was sharing tea with her friend, Lady Sylvine, and she waited politely to be spoken to before proudly displaying the lenses. After the obligation of being seen and the expected comments, she'd excuse herself. A few steps down the hallway, she noticed her bag was undone. Concerned about the delicate lenses inside, she set it down to properly seal it, rather than risk them falling to the ground.
I don't know how you do it, Father, Sylvine said heavily. She's a strange one. Moody, just like her mother. I know, Syl, but we do our best.
The words had struck her with disbelief, leaving her momentarily speechless. But even at the age of 10, she possessed enough sense to know that those words weren't for her ears. Cautious of making any sound, she picked up her bag and quietly retreated up the hallway, the weight of those words settling heavily in her mind. Despite only being 10, she'd had the sense to contemplate what she'd heard. The words felt like revelation, but the idea was difficult to accept. They needed clarification. She took it upon herself to embark on a quest for the answers, starting with an extensive investigation at the library. Methodically, she pieced together the fragments of information she discovered, each thread leading her to the next. A wedding record, a military service roster, an elusive missing name, and finally, a birth record that bore her own name. With each step, she grew more determined to unravel the mystery that surrounded her identity. Every document she found listed a woman named HFY. Shortly after that pivotal moment, she couldn't resist the urge to plead with her mother for the use of her desk omni, arguing that the model in her own room lacked the necessary capabilities to work on the project she was developing. She assured her mother that it would only take a few hours. It was a ruse, but it got her what she needed. She planned to meticulously search through the files, and had been surprised when it proved to be an almost effortless task. 3 files, set aside in a subfolder, came up in moments with a simple search for HFY. While she desperately wanted to find some confirmation, just as much of her had prayed to be proven wrong. The anticlimax was almost worse than either. The depth of the lie was awful, but the incredible shallowness of it had been appalling. The discovery unsettled her deeply, but what tormented her after was the persistent itch of unanswered questions. There was no guidance or assistance to be found in her family. Whatever the truth was, her mothers, her sisters, they'd all accepted the lie, and she'd had no choice but to follow along with the charade, pretending to be someone she was not, all the while oblivious to her own identity. It was a disconcerting existence, an uncertain balancing act to pretend not to know, while yearning to unravel the unknowable truth. Just like my mother? What did that even mean? It will mean what I make it mean, she whispered softly into the twilight. The rain had finally stopped, and though remnants of the storm still roared past, the clouds were heading inland. Tomorrow would be blue skies. The melody stuck in her head. She quietly sang out the words. I'll get by with a little help from my friends. The very idea of the years Professor Warwick spent alone was chilling. Horrible. She'd felt alone in her own home, but she still had people there. Her solitude had been self-imposed reality, rather than a physical one. Maybe humans just weren't as social as Shovanti, and didn't depend on the company of others. It was a stark contrast. No Shovanti could have done it. Goddess help anyone who had to be that alone. She shook her head in wary amusement, a soft laugh escaping her. She wasn't alone anymore, and the song was like a charm against the dark. Gonna try with a little help from my friends. Ringo? So the twins liked Ringo. Ringo isn't so bad. She flopped back in bed, yanking up the covers and snuggling in. But I'd still do Paul. Nothing lasts forever. Some things aren't meant to be. But you'll never find the answers until you set your old heart free. Until you set your old heart free. Heart pounding, Kadira raced through the grand corridors in her palace of memory, past the upper gallery toward the stairs leading out. Flickering candlelight had replaced the bright lights in the galleries of her mind. Her senses filled the sense of dust, decay, blood, and forgotten memories. Normally quiet, the portraits she passed were alive. Failed, didn't you? Dame Selakai crowed from her gallery. We're never dead until we're forgotten, and you can't forget. Her palace of memories had always been a refuge, shelter, and a source of strength. Who needed to rely on traceable omnipad recordings when one could call facts to mind, effortlessly impressing your superiors with your skill and quality? It had been a boon, tracking down her quarries, one after another, both in her official duties and her more extracurricular activities. More and more she'd returned, in the days since circumstances forced her to remove her picture gallery. It was a mere trifle, but seeing her successes felt validating. A wellspring of renewal. Now her strength had turned into a nightmare, as she plunged through the labyrinthine corridors, the sound of footsteps always behind her. No matter how fast she ran, they were always there, while the whispers and catcalls of her personal spectres chortled and wailed, reaching out for her with skeletal hands. The tide goes in, the tide goes out. The palace was always quiet, a place of solitude, each room holding a piece of history or information she deemed useful. Now her naked feet pounded on the marble, cold and unyielding. With every turn, the palace seemed to shift and wail, the cacophony of her memories drowning her. Out! She had to get out! Reaching the bottom of the stair, she sprinted towards the foyer. The golden chandelier swayed in a rigid storm, battering at her as scraps of pictures and flies flew past like dead leaves. The voices of the spectres were clear, but always there was the tap of footsteps, booming on the marble close behind. The tide goes in, the tide goes out. The words grew past a whisper, a discordant clamour of voices speaking in the darkness. The words were familiar, but she was too busy running to place them. She reached the far side of the foyer and slammed against the door, bouncing back as it refused to open. The room felt like ice as she cried out, her voice lost in the torrent of wind and sound, the doors refusing to yield as she battered against them, desperate to be free. The tide goes in! The tide goes out! The sound of the footsteps was close now, as there was thundering in the room, and she screamed. Screamed as she woke on the floor of her chamber, huddled against the hard lip of the dumpster, naked and shivering on the cold ceramicrete tile, surrounded by the detritus and scraps littering the floor. She shot upright, wrapping her arms about herself, panting as her heart thundered in her chest. It was all just a dream. Just a dream. Her palace hadn't failed her. It was all just a bad dream. She closed her eyes and gulped down lungfuls of air, shivering against the cold. The floor never felt this cool, but it must be the chill of winter seeping through the walls. She'd tend to that. Another detail to tend to. Another stone on the mound burying her. Shielding her from her true calling. Holding her back from... What's a disappointment. That's what you are, you know. The voice rambled in a drunken slur, angrily stumbling through the words. You're pathetic. You know what you are. Pathetic. Her eyes shot open as she stared into the perfect darkness of her room. Mother!